Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Alice Hernandez. My pronouns are she and her. I'm a senior program administrator at University Online Education Services at Rutgers University. On behalf of the 2025 Rutgers University Online Learning Conference, I welcome Kaylin Padovano, Director of Education and Outreach at Rutgers University Office of Equity and Inclusion, and Erica Friedman, Director of the Tyler Clementi Center for Diversity, Education, and Bias Prevention at Rutgers, New Brunswick. We are pleased to have them share their thoughts on proactive, empathetic, and trauma-informed approaches to interrupting bias in the online classroom. During the presentation, please engage using the live chat session. You may post any questions you have, and the presenters will answer as we go along and as time permits. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much, Alice, and welcome everyone. Thank you so much for being here today at the end of the day. And as Alice mentioned, we're going to be talking about how bias manifests in the online classroom, in the Zoom environment, in online asynchronous spaces. We originally developed this workshop for addressing bias when it occurs in real time in the classroom, but we've really adapted it. And this is an interactive workshop. We want to hear from all of you. We're going to be asking for tons of participation, mostly in the chat today. We have some polls. And we'll have about 45 minutes with some time for Q&A. So we want to leave time for questions and answers at the end. And what are you seeing? How is this coming up for you? So we can work through that together. My name is Kaylin Padovano. Thank you so much for the introduction, Alice. I use she, her pronouns. I'm a licensed social worker, so I come from a background in trauma-informed care and intervention. Pivoted into higher education. I also teach in an online space. So some of the examples you'll be hearing are coming from stuff that myself and Dr. Friedman have dealt with. And I'll give my colleague, Erica, a chance to introduce themselves as well.
Hi, everyone. Welcome. And yeah, thank you for being here at the end of the day. You stuck it through, and we really appreciate you coming out for this one. Again, thank you, Alice, for the introduction, but I'll just share I welcome all pronouns. I have been doing this work for over 10 years. I've taught in the classroom in the field of psychology. My background is as a social psychologist. Have taught a lot of gender and sexuality-based classes, as well as personality and social psychology. And also taught a lot of introductory kind of research courses and overseen student research. So yeah, been in a lot of spaces with students where things tend to pop up. So we're going to get right into it here. I'm going to pass it back to Kaylin to kick us off.
Thank you. So as we mentioned before, please feel free to turn your camera on. It helps us keep our energy up to see all of you and to hear from you in the chat or using the raise hand feature. We hope that today this will be a low shame, high responsibility environment. So I promise you, Erica and I are not going to pull you too far into the social work, social science weeds, but we are going to talk about, some sensitive topics. We're going to talk about implicit bias. We're going to talk about how racism, sexism, homophobia, anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, ableism manifests in the classroom. So we hope that you will take the chance of making a mistake today, and that we are going to hold each other accountable, but with kindness. We also hope that you attend with an open and self-reflective mind, and then know that there is no pursuit of perfection in this work. Erica and I both are equity and inclusion practitioners. We know that there's no perfection in this work, and if there is, please let us know. We haven't found it yet. So this is a lifelong pursuit of being as inclusive and as supportive to students, to colleagues as we possibly can. And also, the workshop is not the work, right? That happens when you get into the online classroom, back into the environment. We can really put this into practice. So no pursuit of perfection. We're all going to mess up, including Erica and I, and we're going to hold each other accountable with kindness. Know that intention might be different than impact. So we're going to actually talk about that when we get into how bias manifests in the online classroom. We're going to work through it. But just know that as we're having these conversations that might be difficult, the intent of our words might be very different than the impact they have on someone. So we just want to acknowledge that, and we'll work through that together. And then my favorite one, we invite you all to turn to wonder. So, if we are feeling maybe uncomfortable or defensive about some of the topics that we're talking about, instead of rushing to judgment of ourselves or of others, pausing to think, what does this teach us about ourselves? I wonder what this is activating in me. Just turn to curiosity, turn to wonder is going to be our final centering thought for today. And if anyone has any other ones they'd like to drop in the chat, please feel free.
All right, so just quick objectives for you all. We're going to talk about bias, including kind of like how we do this here at Rutgers and the context in which bias occurs, why follow-up care is really important. We're going to talk about responding, so learning trauma-informed skills to support students and colleagues in the wake of bias incidents through a case example. And we're going to present that case example to you all initially and just have you kind of percolate on that throughout as we give you different tips. And then at the end, we'll have you actually really think through and share what you would have done maybe differently based on some of the tips that we gave you throughout. And then lastly, we're going to focus on prevention. Some of these things are going to happen no matter what. They're going to pop up, but there are some things that we can put in place to prevent or reduce the instances of bias that can occur. All right, so we just want to quickly check in with y'all. This is our first poll. Alice is helping us out with the poll. So what is the extent to which you are confident you would know what to do if a student experienced bias in your classroom? Let us know what you think. Are you completely confident all the way down to you want to run out of the building because this is so scary to you? This is that participation part of the...
Or you want to run out of your own house if you're teaching the course remotely.
Right.
I love that feeling.
Or just close out of the Zoom. You want to close out of the Zoom. I see those votes coming in. It looks like we've got across the board, but nobody seems to be completely confident. I think that's about right. We all have maybe a little teeny bit of trepidation. Oh, thank you so much for sharing that. I can see it's over under polls. If you can't see it, you can kind of keep tracking it there. So some of you are somewhat confident. We have a couple that definitely want to run out of the building or close out of that Zoom. Thank you for participating in that. We're hoping that this is going to change by the end. We'll do this poll again a little bit later. All right, so just this is a quick content notice. This is a part of our own trauma-informed practice in this space, is to let you all know kind of what's coming up in the case study that we're about to share. So there is going to be some racism as well as transphobia in this case example. We want to just remind you some techniques that you can use to ground yourself if you're feeling really activated by either of these things in the case study. So, if you need to, maybe you have something next to you to drink, you can kind of hold that in your hand to help ground you. Remind yourself of your feet on the ground and the seat underneath you. You can also breathe. These are just a few tactics, but you may have some others that you often turn to. Maybe it's a little mantra that you tell yourself to remind yourself of where you are. Whatever it might be that helps you out, don't forget to turn to those. So, so I'll turn it over to Kayla now.
Sorry about that, Erica.
No worries, you got it.
Yes, thank you so much. So the first section of our presentation is we're going to be talking about how to identify bias. And then we would also be remiss if we didn't talk about reporting it. So we have some Rutgers-specific information, but we're going to talk about how to identify resources for reporting in your universities as well, or your workplaces as well. So I want to define bias for us. We're keeping it nice and simple. So the definition of bias that we're going to be using today is a tendency, intentional or not, towards certain people, groups, ideas, or outcomes. So in online learning, what does that refer to? It refers to bias or systematic favoritism or tendency that affects the fairness and inclusivity of the overall educational experience. So this can be bias in the content, in algorithms, in instructor interactions that potentially disadvantage certain groups. So addressing that bias is essential for achieving the learning outcomes that you want to receive. So another important definition for us is also what is implicit bias. Most biases that we hold are unconscious. An implicit bias, you'll hear us talk about that. They're automatic, unintentional, unconscious judgments that we all make associating certain social groups with certain stereotypes. So we know, and if you've ever been in an implicit bias workshop before, we know we all have biases. The idea is not to get rid of them. Any, DEI workshop that tells you that they're going to get rid of your biases is BS. So we cannot get rid of it. But what we want to do is how do we practice interrupting those biases in the online classroom before they have the chance to operate. All right, so when we're talking about reporting, we want to give this information. We are not going to stay stuck here on reporting. So most of the behaviors, unfortunately, that we're going to talk about in this workshop do not necessarily rise to the level of a reportable bias incident for someone who is protected under a certain class. So legal definitions of bias, most of that stuff is going to be right in the middle. And that does not mean that we should not address it. But we also want you to be aware of the bias reporting mechanisms. At Rutgers, we have a couple different campuses and a couple different ways to report. So I wish it was less confusing, but for students located on the New Brunswick campus, we have one bias reporting mechanism here, you could see, and that goes for in-person and online environments, regardless of where the student is located, regardless of where you're located. And then we have a different one for faculty and staff. So if you've experienced a bias incident from a student, we will also be talking about that in this workshop. And then our other campuses have slightly different reporting mechanisms. All this is to say, find out, where do you report at your school? Is it through or your workplace? Is it through an online mechanism? Do you have to call? Just knowing this is actually part of our response and part of prevention and preparing ourselves for when it comes up.
Thank you for that, Kaylin. And yeah, so we have a little activity for you all now. This is just to get the juices flowing a little bit. Hope that you all are able to access the chat box and respond. What I want you to do is to look at these images, and you're just going to tell us who you think that they are to each other. So you could just type in the box, like literally anything that comes to mind. Who are these two individuals to each other? This is the same photo, or the same two individuals in these two different photos, just showing you them in two different, kind of poses and instances in their life. What do you think their relationship is to each other? And if you know these two people, I ask that you refrain from typing that in the chat. If you happen to know their story or have seen them in the media before, just refrain from sharing it. But for now, yeah, perfect. I see some of you already sharing, close friends, partners. Yeah, keep sharing. If you have other ideas of maybe how they're related to each other, keep sharing that. They're close, so perhaps they are partners, sisters, or friends. Awesome. I really appreciate you all sharing your ideas. Dating, friends, partners, relatives. I'll refrain because I know their story. Great, Raj, thank you. They're close. It's hard to tell beyond that. Yeah. So what's really interesting about their relationship is that they are actually twins. And so, our instance of looking at two individuals who maybe look like they do can sometimes bias us because we don't always know what people's stories are. So, we often tell stories about our students just based on their appearance or how they may be interacting with each other. So I want you to just think to yourself for a second. If you feel like sharing in the chat, you're fine to do so, but this is more self-reflective, is to just think about, what stories do we tell about our students just based on their appearance or how we think they're relating to each other in the classroom? And how might these stories impact our interactions with our students? This is the kind of thing we do in all parts of our lives. It's very natural to do it. It's not to kind of like shake a finger and being like, oh no, you made up a story about someone that's not true, or you made an assumption about somebody. But it's really about being aware that we can jump to conclusions about people just based on those visual things that we see. And what we invite you to do in the future is just take a pause before you do that, or also understand that other people may not be taking that pause and may be jumping to conclusions. And that's also where their own biases are coming from.
Thanks, Erica. It reminds me of a story of one of my own experiences. I was teaching a course and had a former police officer in my course who was a lot older than most of the students, and had really, really great insight, was pivoting to social work, and really, really interesting story. And I assumed that this person was going to have kind of more conservative beliefs maybe, or want to go into maybe a certain type of social work. But I found out that was like not the case at all. And he was actually a super artistic person. He lived with his husband in Jersey City. And just based on my biases, based on his profession, I had an idea about this student that was completely wrong. And how might that manifest in the online classroom? Would I even have been able to gather all of that valuable information about the student if we're not purposefully taking steps in the online classroom to open up those kinds of discussions, regardless of what our subject is? So social work, we have a little more leeway, but we'll talk about ways to do that even if you are in the sciences, even if you are in mathematics. So before I go any further, I just want to give a quick moment. What do you all think bias in the online classroom looks like? And this should say online classroom, since we could do a whole other discussion about in person. But just type it right in the chat. What might it look like in the online classroom as it comes up in the moment? Definitely, again, we all have biases. We got to interrupt them before they have the chance to operate. Definitely, maybe me not calling on that student to talk about certain topics because of my unconscious bias, and not being conscious of that.
Slanted remarks in a chat, yeah.
Yes, and we'll talk about that. We'll kind of name that slanted. What we will talk about. And I hope this hasn't happened to you, but it might come up. We'll talk about real examples of racist, homophobic comments that have come up in chat, unfortunately.
Yeah, assumptions based on names, like that's bias coming from you as a faculty member potentially, but also from other students when they're seeing that.
Definitely. Yeah, so again, bias comments, and it's not always coming in real time in the Zoom room, right? It might be comments that are posted on message boards, posted in assignments. Maybe only you see it, maybe the whole class can see it, and you might not catch it right away. So we'll talk about how to address that. Yeah, ignoring someone, Shahida. And Jody, if you're comfortable, say more about disengagement in breakout rooms. I'm thinking I know maybe because of bias that student might be experiencing, they're not going to want to participate. That is absolutely correct. Yeah, talking over someone, ignoring someone, repeating a point that someone has made. Yeah, absolutely. And who does that happen to? That happens to, a lot of times in tech, it happens to our female students more. It happens to our students who maybe English is not their first language, so they might not be able to articulate things as quickly as some of the other students. But if we're not making sure we are being patient and maybe giving a little bit of extra time, they might get just completely trampled over in the discussion. All right, so we're going to reveal our list. These are amazing examples too. Pauline, thank you for sharing that too. Instructors can make assumptions based on the student work or the way that they're engaging, especially in online classrooms. And we're going to talk about some unique barriers with that. You are not really seeing how a student is presenting in person, and that can be harder sometimes. And we'll talk about ways to address that. So bias, like we talked about a little bit in the beginning, it can be that you are using a curriculum that's biased, so has lack of representation, is not, and even again, if it's math and scientists, isn't representative of the full range of contributors to that field. And then certainly stereotyping. So stereotyping certain students to be underachieving, and then certain students to be overachieving. So again, this happens a lot. What we see with our Asian or South Asian students in math and science, negatively stereotyping, oh, they have it great, they're not going to need any help. We shouldn't go in with that assumption. Tokenism, favoritism, especially in the online classroom, it's tough. And this might be just that student who you hear from all the time. It's a lot easier to manage that in an in-person classroom than it is to try to balance out who's participating virtually. And then institutional bias. So things like unequal disciplinary policies. We'll talk more about that as we go along a little bit. Ignoring difference. So not ignoring that there may be a difference in, a student who is joining you in the online classroom from a home where they're living with multiple generations of their family, where there's a lot going on. They might not have a private space. This came up a lot during COVID. The assumption that all students are going to have access to that type of space or access to the technology that they need for the class. Ability grouping and tracking. So, all right, all of you are going to be in this breakout room, and all of you who are kind of lagging behind are going to be in this one. What that does is it kind of, what we say in K through 12, tracks students so they're not getting an opportunity to interact with maybe students who are a little bit more ahead and getting to benefit from that. We could probably have a whole training on that, but just in a nutshell, we talked about expectation bias, gatekeeping. So hoarding information and only giving that to maybe students that you have a particular relationship with. Response bias. Do we have the stat in there?
On discussion boards, right? Like that's a big one for response bias.
Yes, we shared in the resource folder, I believe, a study of online classrooms that showed that white male students were called on. I believe it was at a higher rate. I don't want to mess it up, at a higher rate than any other students in the classroom. Ableism. So that goes from everything from participation. So not communicating to students what accommodations are available, whether that's captioning, whether that's any other resources that student might need. And that is just in participation. Then in grading and communicating with students, making sure that you're open to if students do have accommodations, and just mentioning that can be helpful. And we'll talk more about that. And then the racial slurs, the explicit incidences of bias, which we're going to talk about. They unfortunately happen. All of the examples are real that we talk about. Linguistic bias is a huge one. And then unequal application of policies. We're going to talk about policies that can be protective against the impact of bias. And when we have policies in our classroom, our online classroom, we want to make sure we're applying those policies to everyone equally. Erica, do you have anything to add to this slide? I know we're going to add more as we build and go along, but
yeah, I'll add for the ableism one, the participation grading piece. That is when you're basically grading participation based on, are you coming on mic and speaking up and saying, an answer to something, and you're grading people on how much they come on mic. Well, for some folks, it may not be comfortable actually like speaking verbally like that. And that is maybe a part of their experience with their disability. So creating other pathways for them to participate so that they can also be graded for participation, but in other ways, like, saying something in the chat or maybe sharing materials after class, like on the discussion board, or just some other method for people to get a participation grade.
Thank you. And Raj, I think you segue perfectly into our next slide, because we are, whether we know it or not, we are operating on biases in just seeing a student's profile picture or just seeing them in a little box. And it's even more, I would say, more opportunity to kind of make assumptions when we don't know each other in person. So we have to be all the more mindful of how that's impacting our interactions with students. And an additional challenge, again, is not being in person, not being in the room with that individual. The learning curve of technology. So, is this student not participating? Is this student being standoffish? Or are they just, they're a freshman student, or they haven't used this type of technology before? Exacerbation of existing disparities. Tech will absolutely do that. That is why our amazing, our colleagues putting on this conference exist at Rutgers. Tech can exacerbate those inequalities that are already there in access, in ability to just maximize their experience in the online classroom. The lack of physical cues and context is really tough as well in the online setting, especially for students who are neurodivergent. We're able to navigate that more in person, but maybe not online. There's an increased space for misinterpretation, and we're going to talk about that. So misunderstandings can happen, and And, you can't always assess someone's tone when they're typing in the chat, or students can't always assess your tone, and body language is missed sometimes. And then unfortunately, that also emboldens some students and some faculty to behave in a way that is more harmful, right? So that is where, especially when it's anonymous in the online classroom, where we have seen the slurs and where we have seen the blatantly discriminatory language, and then there's less accountability. So what happens is, and this is the whole point of why we're working together today, what happens is a lot of times it will go unaddressed. The instructor will say, I hope no one saw that, and I'm just going to move on. We're going to talk about why that's not the best way to address it. Increased isolation in the online classroom, especially this came up during COVID, can be difficult to address when harm has happened. And then building trust in general is harder in the online environment. And Erica's going to share some tools that we can use to build trust. And again, we have to address this. So the idea is we're going to give you so many different ways to address bias, but the idea is that we're not doing nothing. We can do a variety of different things. The worst thing to do is nothing. And also, you are all doing so many things already that are helpful and are even trauma informed, and we want to build on that.
All right, y'all. I'm going to read off to you our case study, and this is the only case study we're going to go through today. Right now, what I'm going to ask is that you just really think about this one and self-reflect. So this, again, does have a racist remark in it. So just, again, a content notice for that. But a professor announces that there will be randomized assignment to a group project. During the announcement, students anonymously post their questions or comments on an interactive web platform for the professor to answer. One student posts, "Please don't assign me to a group with a Black person," which is seen by all students in attendance as responses are projected over Zoom to everyone in the class. The professor does not respond to the comment in the moment, but later posts in Canvas that the class will no longer use the platform over Zoom, effective immediately. So, breathe and take that one in, right? It's a lot to hear. This is something that actually did happen in our community at Rutgers. It was an incident that we were made aware of. So this isn't just something that we made up, but we did kind of make it a composite of a different scenario that did occur also on campus with how the response was handled. So we made sure that it was also applicable to the online classroom for you all. So I just want you to self-reflect right now. How do you think you would have reacted in this situation? Has something like this maybe happened to you before in the classroom? How did you handle it? And if you're kind of taking in this case study and thinking about, okay, well, how would you have responded to this particular situation, maybe differently than the professor in this case study did? Just going to pause for a few seconds, let you kind of reflect before we keep going here. Okay, so before we even get into talking about how to respond to this situation, we want to share with you some techniques for what we call harm reduction. Because again, we can't eliminate bias. We can't do, everything that we can only do everything that we can do, but we still will probably have these instances occur. But there are some strategies that we can take to reducing the impact and reducing the chance for bias to come up. So we're about to introduce a number of different tools to respond to bias. So you want to, take what's useful to you for now. So we're going to start with these two. So one is developing written guidance and norms whenever possible and revisiting them very often. Much like Kaylin and I shared with you all the 5 agreements right at the start of this, that was really setting up and framing the space that we were working in today. So same thing for your online classroom. To really try to come up with that guidance right at the beginning, and not just in your syllabus, but we're talking about providing that guidance up front and in the classroom, not just, hey, go read the syllabus, but here, let's actually talk about these and think about these together and what this means to our space. The second thing is clarifying any reporting procedures that do exist. So that's also something that certainly can go in your syllabus, but you want to make bias policies and reporting procedures very clear. Like, what is going to happen if bias occurs in your classroom? What are the steps that you're going to take? What are the university's steps to addressing those things? These strategies can be really effectively accomplished by involving students in the process of the decision making. So when this happens, how are we all going to deal with this together as a class? So I wanted to share with you all a tool that I've used in the classroom with my students before. It's called a social contract. The purpose of this contract is to empower your students to be a part of developing what the kind of framework is for your class and the brave space that you're creating together. It's about building trust. So it's really being transparent with your students about, hey, here is like how the classroom is going to be run, but also like you get to be a part in the design of that. And so it's a trust building activity. It helps students feel invested in their learning environment. And it also creates a kind of peer-to-peer accountability, but also peer-to-professor. So like you're abiding by the same rules as everybody else in that space. So a social contract, it's basically a negotiated agreement between you and the students, and it gives you this opportunity to design it together and have safeguards that are in place. And usually the way that I would do this is I would have one, section of like one of the very first classes, so that kind of syllabus day class, where I would even designate a student, maybe just like randomly select or ask for a volunteer of a student who will assist in actually coming up with that social contract. So if this isn't an asynchronous course, you can certainly do that over Zoom, where you even have the student share screen and type up right into a Word document what are the agreements that everybody's coming to. And the guide that I'm going to show you here, if you want, you can scan this and go to this guide or go to the go.rutgers.edu link there, and you'll get the guide, and it gives you prompts for questions to ask the students to really think through all the different aspects of your classroom that are important to think through in order to create a space that is, something that they're all a part of, but also that they can feel brave in, and that will hopefully help hold everybody accountable to, not saying biased comments or, hey, if that does occur, here is what we're going to all do to hold that student accountable in that space. There's other aspects of the social contract too, like simple things like, how are we going to handle, the different parts of the work in the classroom and all of that. But there is one section that is specifically about addressing bias.
And hold students accountable and hold ourselves accountable for when we have maybe said something or done something that was biased. And we're going to go over that. It's the hardest part, I think, but we'll also talk about, and we have both been on that side as well, what to do when we're the ones who
absolutely
messed up.
Absolutely. It works both ways, always. So everybody in that space is to be held accountable. So some things to also reduce harm in the classroom, again, does involve you, right? Asking for feedback from your students and being ready to accept it. It may be really hard to hear sometimes that a student was hurt by something that you said, right? And if you have an anonymous pathway for them to share that with you, you may be getting that kind of feedback, and just, really prepare yourself to accept that, hey, like, yeah, I did cause harm. Again, we're all not perfect. We're not robots. We're going to make mistakes sometimes, and that may come up. Ongoing learning and leaning into discomfort. So reminding yourself that, you're still learning too. You may be an expert in the topic that you teach, but there's still a lot to learn about other people and communities, and really leaning into that discomfort of, hey, I might not know something here and may have to really listen to my students. Being as consistent as you can in applying your own policies or the university's policies. So that's really going to prevent bias in how you apply specific like disciplinary or taking points off of something, or if a student comes to you with an excuse for some work, are you always going to excuse it for every student? Those kinds of things. Building in equity, so making sure that into your policies, you're already building in some pieces to think about in terms of equity, and how can you ensure that you understand that not every student is exactly the same, and so some may need some different kinds of accommodations than others. And then lastly, consulting and reaching out to resources within your university, making sure that you understand all the different tools that are available to you and technologies that are available to you. For example, in Canvas, there may be an option to include pronouns, like making sure that you use that for yourself and you encourage your students to use it, etc. All right.
Sorry. We're like an echo. I love it. We're so in sync. So responding, we're going to talk about what to do if you have been the one, again, who has made the misstep. We're going to talk about ways to respond when we see this coming up in the classroom, and how to follow up as well. All right, so you've caused the harm. So this is, again, probably, it's easy to talk about what we would do if we see others when this is happening, but what do we do when it's us? And the first step is to accept the feedback, like Erica was saying. Thank you for telling me that. This happened to me with a student who I was mispronouncing their name repeatedly, and I probably did it for like the third time. And I felt a lot of shame and embarrassment. Oh my God, how did I do that again? It's hard, but just accepting the feedback. Acknowledging what happened, both the intent and impact. I didn't mean to label you. I didn't mean to mispronounce your name, but resisting the urge to explain it away. So, but you might have heard me wrong. And, oh, well, I said it right before. No, just I didn't mean to do that, but I see that I did. It can be very, very powerful. And then a step that we skip often is just apologize. So again, instead of trying to justify, explain it away, I'm sorry. Period. Not, oh, well, I'm sorry you were offended that I said your name wrong. And of course, we have dealt with instructors too who are unable to take this feedback and say, well, your name is too hard to pronounce. I'm not even going to try, or I'm going to call you by this nickname. That is not okay for so many different reasons. But just apologizing and adjusting. You would not, if you stepped on someone's foot and they said, ouch, you say, oh, I'm sorry. You wouldn't stomp on it again. I hope. I don't think anyone in this room would do that, but adjust. Try not to repeat the same offense in the future, but better yet, demonstrate that through your actions. So it's easy to say, I'm never going to do that again, but best thing to do is just don't do it again. And then this one is a little tricky. So you absolutely can ask if, we are not going to know all the identities that someone holds, or when every single time that we may have hurt them in any way. Like, absolutely not. That is, we are not robots. We are not AI. We're not going to know. So ask. I'm trying to learn here. I'm just not sure what that I said carried the harm. But remember, it is not that person's obligation to teach you, or teach you about their whole identity, or teach you about their whole community. So lean on us. We give our contact information. Google's your friend. You might have to do your own research. But if you ask with sincerity, that's absolutely a step that you can take to clarify.
And I would add, if you're going to ask an expert to share some information with you on this topic, offer them something. Like, I don't know, send them a gift card or just something to show your appreciation for them taking the time to teach you about this, or to share some research with you so that you can learn more. I did this once where I was having an interaction with a student, and they, were complaining about a particular topic that I had no idea was something that, was experienced in their community, and I knew nothing about it. So I went to a friend of mine who works at a totally different university, explained the situation, was like, do you have some time that you can give to this to share some feedback? And they said, sure. And so they gave me some feedback. And then I sent them and their wife a gift card to go to a restaurant, just as like a thank you to show my appreciation. So Kaylin and I have mentioned this a number of times already, but I'm going to pass this back to Kaylin.
Yes, so surprise, surprise, you are not a robot. So we are not going to get this right every single time. And we actually can't tell you how to deal with every situation of bias in the classroom, because every situation is so completely different. So we're going to kind of go over a protocol on steps that we can take. But one of the most important steps is acknowledging your own limitations. Like Erica was saying, you have limited time, especially in the online classroom. You have your own kind of thoughts and feelings about what's happening too. So acknowledging what your kind of triggers are can be helpful. And it is absolutely okay. We're going to say this along or every step along the way. It is okay to circle back to something. If you're not sure, if maybe you didn't address it like you wanted to in the moment, absolutely okay. you may miss some of the structural barriers that are unique to the online environment that your students are experiencing. But you want to first acknowledge that that's okay. You have to have flexibility to accommodate these things as they come up as best you can, but we're absolutely not going to get it perfect every time.
Yes, give yourself grace.
Yeah, we're going to probably say that like 50 times as we continue in this section. So our framework for responding in the moment, leading with authenticity and transparency, being clear, and this really helps to do this up front too, like during when you're doing the social contract, what you can do and what you can't do. And vulnerability is helpful there. And we're going to talk about more what that looks like. Understanding cultural humility. What that means is really just the idea that you cannot know everything about every person's culture or identity, but you're approaching with an open and curious stance. And you're not, like Erica said, asking, putting pressure on that student to educate you, but you are receiving that information in a way that's open and in a way that you can incorporate into your practice. Recognizing power dynamics. So believe it or not, you have the most power in that online space. If you're in a room with your students, that might shift if you're in other spaces, but recognizing how your inaction can also be sending messages as well. And then the challenge here is to be vulnerable and discerning. So we want to share, but also we want to make sure we're not sharing too much, oversharing, or leaving ourselves vulnerable in a way that we feel like we can't even go on with the rest of our day because of the interactions that we had in the online classroom. So the first step, if you do nothing else, stop, take a breath. This just happened. So the example that we're going to use, and again, this comes from real things that we've seen around Rutgers, kind of a composite. But in the med schools, there was an online asynchronous course where there was a message board. And one of the doctors said in a message board that they could not treat trans patients because they did not agree with their lifestyle. So this is something, well, we're going to talk, I'm not going to reveal the entire scenario here because we're going to talk about how we might work through this. The instructor did not see this till many days after it was posted. So it's not really necessarily taking a breath in the moment, but observing this happened. What do I want to do next? But just stop and take a breath. Erica, do you have anything to add to this? Steps is so important.
Yeah, I would just quickly say, especially if it's something like this scenario where you didn't see it and it maybe was posted for a while, or you're not sure how long it was posted. Try to find out when the incident happened. When did you see it versus is there a timestamp on that post that, gives you a sense of how long this has been up there. And so therefore how many people might have seen it and kind of how much harm it has maybe caused within the time between it getting posted and you being notified of it.
And that's step 2, addressing.
So the next piece is actually addressing it. So again, I want to reemphasize the step 1, you got to take that pause and that breather for yourself, especially if you happen to be a member of the group that's being targeted, or that you're also personally harmed by this because you have people in your life who are trans. So really taking that moment to really breathe and really process before you address it. So addressing it means, first of all, acknowledging it. So as soon as you're made aware of it, make sure that you acknowledge it to the class. Even if you have to kind of take a break after you acknowledge it before you do any more action points, definitely acknowledge it first and foremost. Get that out of the way or get that out there first, because the longer you kind of let it sit there, the more harm it can cause, and also the more questions will come up for your students about what is going on with this, right? So you want to acknowledge it, name what just happened, and then you can kind of move into some very, very simple but very direct responses. So you want to be very clear about how you're going to address this, what you're going to do, and give some clear next steps. A part of the being simple and direct is, maybe emphasize that people might have been affected by this. Maybe you are affected by this. You can feel free to be like as vulnerable as you feel like here and really share what you are feeling personally about what was said. And then, explain, okay, here's what we're going to do next. I'm going to be, getting some folks to come and talk more about this with you all. I'm going to be, deleting this comment so it doesn't cause further harm. I'm going to, right? So you're going to explain what the steps are and like why you are taking the next steps that you're taking, and certainly consult or go back to your social contract for what the agreements were between you and the rest of the students about how to respond to this if you have those in place.
Thank you. And then we're just asking you to choose one of these as the follow-up. You might be able to do all of them, and that's wonderful, but it really depends on your context. So can you, and do you have the skills to be able to process this with the class? So if you are in a classroom that's more discussion-based, maybe we're going to leave the comments up and we're going to open it up for a safe discussion with our guidelines. Remember our social contract from the beginning of the course, and you might be able to process it. Are you in a space where that is just not you? That's not something you feel equipped to do. You might not have the time to do it. You may proceed differently. You may just follow up with that, you respond, you name what happened, and say, I'm going to follow up individually with the people who are impacted. You refer folks to resources. We're going to give a resource folder for everyone, and then follow up. It's really, really important to follow up with, especially the person who was impacted, just to check in and to make sure that you're not just kind of leaving this open. Because remember, we said that inaction or perceived inaction could send the message that you're okay with this happening in the online space. And we know that that's not true. Could look like many things. You might check in with the class as a whole. You might post resources to the discussion board. Again, it's a range. It does not have to be this, huge, big intervention. What do you feel comfortable with? What does the situation call for? What do you have time for? What do you have resources for? But the key is just don't do nothing. Don't run away out into the street. And hopefully you have a couple more options. This is just a resource that we're giving. So we have a Speak Up campaign here at Rutgers. We partner with Learning for Justice, and this can be shared with students as well. So this is a community thing. What do we do when we see bias come up? And you could absolutely use all of these as the instructor and just as a tool for holding each other accountable as a community. It's very, very useful too. So there's the QR code. And we'll also, if we didn't mention this already, we'll have a copy of the whole PowerPoint in the resource folder too, so you can look into it a little more there.
Thank you, Kaylin. By the way, I love the Speak Up strategies, and I think they're useful to just many different parts of life, not just in educational environments. So the case study again, if you all feel inclined, in the chat, share a few things that maybe you would do differently now that you have some examples, some tips that we've provided throughout this presentation. Feel free to throw those in the chat. What would you do differently in this particular situation where this student had said this in response to being randomly assigned to a group project?
And what would you do differently aside from what this professor did do, which was delete the whole platform?
Right. Just like nobody's going to share things anonymously anymore. Following some of the steps or some of the examples that we gave, feel free to share those in the chat. And while you do so, I'm going to move forward and share this resource folder with you all so you can scan that. And that has some biased resources. Thank you, Alice, for putting the link in the chat. Appreciate it. And lastly, we would love to check in again with you all. So this is our poll from the beginning. We want to see how you're feeling now. Seems like the same poll. It kind of is, but it's about after you've gone through this whole presentation, how do you all feel now?
And then Carrie shared in the chat explaining why not using the platform, why you made that decision. Yes, the transparency around that. So maybe that was a decision that you might come to, but why? Having that discussion, addressing, that it's not necessarily the platform, it's the racist comment that was made, right? Or rethinking having anonymous posts to begin with. and why. I think that's the important part, not just like we're getting rid of this with no explanation, right? Have the conversation. This happens, and that is why I, as an instructor, Harlan, thank you for sharing that. I don't use anonymous posts, but just explaining, having some context behind it, not just kind of skirting the issue by deleting the platform.
Did we get the poll up there again, Alice?
Yes, we did. We also have a question in the Q&A from Maria. How would you handle claims of reverse racism or reverse sexism in the context of social construct?
I mean, I would just say that you as an individual don't need to be the expert on how to respond to these things, right? You can bring in somebody from outside to address it. You can find resources and post that. I just want to make sure everybody knows, you never need to feel like you need to know exactly how to respond to each and every little instance of bias that occurs. It's more about responding to it in that moment, making sure you acknowledge that it happened, talking about how it made you feel and how it might have caused harm to other people, and then talking about the steps that you're going to take to address it. Kaylin, did you have anything you wanted to just quickly say to that?
No, I think that's excellent. And I think when we hear kind of reverse racism or reverse bias, without getting it could be a whole training in and of itself, but just asking the student to explain a little bit more. What do you mean? What are the specific behaviors that you've experienced? Because focusing on the behaviors rather than the label, what we most often see is that that's not what they're talking about at all. They're talking about maybe they expected preferential treatment and they're not getting it. So just kind of helping them to unpack that a little bit more can be helpful, but also that is why we didn't say every single example of what you might find, because lean on the resources, lean on making those referrals, and lean on reaching out, whether it's to us or a colleague. You're not going to be the expert on all that.
Yeah, these speak up strategies I think are really great. And you kind of were saying one of them, Kaylin, which is question, be like, why do you say that? And I wouldn't actually interrogate the student in that moment, right? If you want to make an educational moment out of it, bring that student to the side so you can educate that student, but also bring it back to the larger class and have a discussion around it if you feel comfortable doing that, right?
It's actually not helpful. You telling me that you're a victim of reverse racism, that doesn't give me any information that will be helpful to actually support you. So I think asking those questions can give us the actual information we need to be able to support the student.
Mm-hmm. I hope
Thank
that
you all
answers
for
it for
joining us. Sorry to cut you off, Dr. Friedman. We invite you all to join us on the main stage for closing remarks. Thank you, Kaylin. Thank you, Erica.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.